So I'm enlisting Pastor Tim as my accomplice art thief. I wandered into the sanctuary with this morning and thought, at least if I'm going to steal it, bringing it into a church is pretty good. This usually sits in our sort of lobby right in front of the office at here at church, and it has worked on me over the last few years. I think sometimes I walk past it and I don't see it, but often things soak in when you don't know, right? And so as our ministry staff has talked a bit about our imaginations and our hopes and listenings for God's Spirit here in this congregation, a phrase has kind of arisen that captures some of what we think are God's hopes for us. And you can find it at the top of the first white page of your bulletin in bold there, Growing Disciples for Life. We feel like that describes what we are called to do and be as a faith community, and so we're going to unpack that in the next few weeks, sometimes using texts from the lectionary, sometimes using texts that fit more with our theme. And this week, we get to talk about this beautiful tree. We get to use this image to think about what it means to be growing in faith. And there's a few pieces of this growing image that I think might be part of why it has captured my imagination. And the first is that growing recognizes that we're works in progress, right? There isn't a point where you want a plant to stop growing. If a plant stops growing, it's dead, right? Every year it grows new leaves. Every year it grows new branches to replace the things that have fallen off. So growth is sort of a perpetual process. And there isn't a moment where you're supposed to say, I should have arrived by now, right? It's an ongoing thing. So that's the first piece. Also, with growing, we recognize that we're not self-sufficient. We have real needs that we cannot supply for ourselves. I cannot make the rain and the dirt and the sunshine for my plants. I can try, but if there's too much rain, I'm out of luck. If there's not enough nutrients in the soil, I'm kind of going by trial and error when I try to fix it, right? And even more for myself. I cannot make the soil, the water, the rain, the sunshine that I need to grow as a disciple. It all comes as a gift. It all comes as a gift. We depend on God for our life. So that's sort of a second piece of growing. And then there's this sense of potential. Not just that we expect to be continuing growing, but we don't even know what could happen. We can only imagine and trust in God's goodness. And the way that I know that this image has been working on us is in the image for our Just Imagine campaign. There's another piece of growing. So it's popping up all over the place. And what I love about this image, you'll find it in your scribe somewhere in the middle-ish. It's in color. That's your biggest clue. So this image, first it's got these reverent hands that I think are so beautiful as a way of sort of reflecting this sense of the magnitude of the gift we've been given, right? This isn't something that we created. Our faith, our community, our calling, our salvation in Jesus Christ is this tremendous gift. And then there's this picture of this small plant that is growing, that has this sense of possibility and potential that's kind of reaching its arms up. And if you look really close, you'll see a familiar shape in that plant reaching its arms up. This sense of possibility. And so growing is a theme and a part of what we are talking about in this campaign to Just Imagine. But for this morning, we're going to stay at the base of the plant, because the language in all of our readings today emphasizes the roots. Maybe you heard that. Picking up on the roots. The phrase in our Ephesians reading that you are being rooted and grounded in love. I have maple trees in my yard. That was part of why we loved the house when we bought it. These beautiful, mature trees that every year shower down maple seeds. And not only do they do it in the fall, I discovered some of them do it in the spring, too. It's like most of them do it in the fall and you think you're done, and then just when things are getting going in the spring, there's a whole new shower of seeds. And you can do your best to sweep them up, and you can go through and you can pick up those little sprouts. But there's a lot of seeds and a lot of yard. And so every year, come kind of midsummer when we're doing some other things around the yard, you look and you see a tree that's already like this big. And at first, the first time I saw that, oh, that's great, I'm just going to pull that out. No. You can put both hands around it, and you can kind of, if you're doing really well, you can even kind of wrap that little tiny trunk around your hand. And if you put your whole body into it, you might pull it out, but you'll probably snap it off. If you do pull it out, you'll see why it was so hard, because the root has gone down that far in 3 months. Bigger than the tree on top is the root down at the bottom, because those trees know that the first thing they need is to be firmly established there in the ground, right? And maybe you've seen trees, maybe you've seen these trees even when it's windy, the way that they can sort of give and sway in the wind. They have to have a good anchor down in the soil so that they're free to wave about in the wind and not just snap off or get pulled up by the wind. And so this idea of being rooted as anchored, I think, is so important. Maybe you have known someone. I hope you have known many someones. You might well be that someone to someone else who is so connected to the grace of God, so rooted in God's love that they are able to withstand and to survive and to face life with courage and grace and generosity in ways that make you go, oh, I want that. Right? You have those people. I hope you do. They are here in our midst that we can see and say, oh, I need that. I see how you are tapped into God's love. Your roots are going towards that stream because you know where the good stuff is, and it keeps you solid. And so I can think of a theology professor who was very powerful in my life when he was facing his own death, was able to teach and to preach about seeing God in the grave. His understanding of the power of the cross was such that he knew Jesus had gone before him into his very own grave. And the ability to share that as good news to other people in the midst of that, whoa. And to talk about what it means to sing Alleluia in a minor key and do it with your whole heart. Oh, I want that. I want that. Or as pastors, we have the privilege of walking with families as they entrust their loved ones who have died into God's care. And so in doing that, we get to see maybe more of the roots that we didn't know about somebody. And I have held in my hands a Bible of one of our saints here at Christ Lutheran Church that was just full of writing. You know how there's extra pages on the front and back of books and there's marked? They were covered. Everything was full of her thoughts and her prayers, notes from Bible study, sort of her own psalms that she had written. It was like her roots were all entangled in that Bible. They were just all wrapped up in there in such a way that she was anchored. Her family told me that if they were ever a little late coming to pick her up from church, they had to be on time. She wasn't very stable on her feet, but if they weren't on time, she was starting walking. So they had to be there, because she was going to go to that water that nourished her no matter what. And we see that and we say, oh, that's what it's like to be rooted, to be anchored. Or maybe you have known someone who was strong enough and wise enough and confident enough in God's grace that they were able to give forgiveness that seemed unimaginable, that they were able to take risks for God's grace that have seemed unimaginable. Maybe you've even had that experience of feeling like God has called you to do something and it's really kind of a stretch, but as you stretch you realize, oh, okay, I can do this. I'm anchored enough that I can actually lean over just a little bit more to that next thing. There's something about being fully connected into God's love. Or maybe you've known somebody that gardens in the sidewalk cracks. And I don't mean that quite literally, but is able to tend to those in-between places that look hopeless, that is able to not give up on things that seem like they are long since dead, and able to be faithful to that and patient with that and to trust that the power of God is present even there because they know the power of God, right? And so maybe you've been that sidewalk crack and someone has tended to you. Or maybe you have seen how plants can get their little seeds into that crack, and as long as the maple root goes down underneath the concrete, oh, it's not coming up, right? It has all it needs, and it can go up, and you are not going to get it out. When your roots are down and reaching towards the streams of God's love and mercy, you're ready. You're ready to follow, right? You're ready to serve. You're ready to take on whatever the wind or the storms might be. So that's one piece of rooted. Another aspect of being rooted makes me think about trees in California. I have not learned the Indiana trees very well. I had a field biology class in high school in California, and those are the trees I had to memorize. Those are the trees I know. But there's something called a manzanita, and it's kind of small and scrubby. Sometimes it makes it to a tree. Often it's more of a bush, not even a glorified bush. And it has this beautiful, smooth red bark, and it lives in a place where rain does not fall very much. You know, when I moved to Indiana, I went, whoa, there's just green everywhere. There are trees everywhere, and that's not really possible in the climate I grew up in. And so there are a few, but they're small, and they have to deal with getting what they can get. And so a manzanita tree, you'll see them, and they'll be beautiful, and in the middle of them, in like what seem like random places, there will be whole dead branches that just branch off. And normally you would think a plant that has disease or has insects, either the whole plant would be affected or it would be all over in one area, and sooner or later that thing's done for. But a manzanita has the ability, when there is a serious drought, to prioritize and to say, these are the branches that are the healthiest and the strongest. This is what we need to focus on. We're no longer going to send water to those other branches. So it's rooted well enough and able enough to read its environment that it's able to respond and adapt and to do what it takes to survive. And when we're rooted well, we can grow and we can adapt. You know about sunflowers, right, that turn to face the sun, or most plants. If you put them by a window and you never turn them, soon they're, stuff like that. Not that I have any of those in my office. But they can adapt and they can adjust to their environment. And so you can see these amazing places where a tree is growing and someone has built a building right up to it. Or when I was traveling once in some Roman ruins, there was an olive tree that had grown around a marble column. And so there was sort of about this much marble, and it's about that round. And this tree had just kind of, okay, all right, I'll adapt, I'll adjust, and it just grew around that column because it was well enough situated that having this thing in its way wasn't a real problem. It could handle that. It was well anchored in the ground. So when we're rooted, we can respond to our environment in good and healthy ways. When we are rooted, we're in a certain context, a certain place. My in-laws live on a lake in Virginia that didn't used to be a lake. The state dammed a river for some power, and so suddenly what used to be sort of very deep canyons and hollows is now a lake, and people come and want to build on this lake. And so my in-laws moved there, and it's a lovely place. They bought their property because it had these fabulous mature trees on it. They're so pretty. And so they move in and they're happy and they finish their place, and at some point the landscaper comes to consult about something else, and just sort of in passing he looks at the trees. He says, I give them about 3 years. And my in-law said, well, what do you mean you give them about 3 years? These are beautiful, mature, And he said, well, this was covered with trees, and there were Virginia pines, which are not as desirable as landscaping trees, in between all of these trees. And they've been ripped up, and bulldozers have come in and out and through, and I am certain that your trees are going to die of bulldozer disease within the next couple of years. And sure enough, about 2 years later, one by one, they just all keeled over. They didn't have that context that they had grown up in. They didn't have those roots intertwined. What had been sort of a stability for them had been yanked out, and there was just no way that they were going to function anymore the way they were supposed to. They had been rooted in a particular place, and you can't always just shift it like that. Now, redwood trees in California have very shallow roots. These are the tallest trees that you can think of, but they have extremely shallow roots, and the way they stay vertical is that they deliberately grow in patches and intertwine their roots. And so there's this big sort of web and net under the ground, and it's not, what affects one tree is being sort of counterbalanced by the weight of the other trees around it, and they're all sort of supporting one another, all tied together there under the ground. And when our roots get intertwined, that is another way that God gives us the grace to anchor us. When I was 17, This may be the only good decision I made at the age of 17, and it probably has a lot more to do with God than with me. I was looking at colleges, and it was boiled down to either UC Berkeley or Valparaiso University. And Berkeley's great. I've got nothing against it. I went there for grad school. But I had this sense that it was too big, and it was too sort of anonymous, and that I needed a place where faith was a part of everyday life, and I needed roots to entwine with in order to finish or grow at least in faith. I wasn't quite to the place where I could just plunk down in the middle of nowhere. I needed a place with an established network of roots so that my faith could grow. And I think about that for our children. We bring them to church so that they can come and get their feet wet in the water, that river of God's love that flows. We bring them so that they can be fed and nurtured, but we also bring them so that their roots can intertwine, right? I bring my kids because I want them to know you and kind of get their roots mixed up with yours. And I want them to know you, and I want them to know you, and I want their roots to be all tangled up with God's people. So that when the wind comes, not only do they have people that they can look at and say, oh, look at that oak tree, I want to be like that. But in fact, we're connected to each other. And we do this for each other all the time, don't we? Being rooted is about being tangled up enough in God's grace that we can depend on it for our lives. At the third service, we're going to bring little baby Lillian to the font, to baptism. And I mean it when I say little. My children were solid. Every time I hold, I'm like, where's the baby? Where? She's tiny, right? But she's going to grow. And we don't know, we can't imagine what she's going to grow into, but we know that she needs to put her roots here. And her family knows that she needs this water of life, both literally in baptism, but all of those streams of God's grace that just show up for us. Streams of forgiveness that show up when we didn't ask for it, or we certainly didn't earn it. Streams of food when we were hungry. Streams of life, of other people's roots that are there for us when we need them. They know, Lily's parents, that they're not going to be able to do this by themselves, and that you don't get to be a big oak tree without being planted somewhere by the grace and love of God. We don't magically create this. And there are times in our lives that are dry and difficult, but we know that God comes to us again and again and again in His love and in His forgiveness and in His grace. And sometimes that is in the life of a congregation. Sometimes that is by engaging in study, in our faith-walking retreats, in Bible study groups, in family and faith, in those sorts of things, in picking up a devotion book on your way out of the sanctuary that I'm sure someone will announce. Ways of study. Maybe it is in community and intertwining your roots in a bread breakers group, or in enjoying the fellowship of serving at the popcorn fest. Maybe the stream of grace that is flowing by that your roots can entangle into is service. We think maybe that in service we're bringing that water to someone else, but in fact usually what happens is God's watering us, right? And so engaging with the social ministry projects that we have going, with Lutheran World Relief, with our men's shelter, with our group that cares for the created world that we've been given. We have this patch of dirt that God has said, okay, it's yours, take care of it. And the ways that we care for that. Maybe it's in leading in worship or serving and preparing God's table. All of these ways that we might serve usually end up being ways that we are served, that God's grace flows to us, and that we can get our roots down a little deeper. In Ephesians, it says that I pray that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith as you are being rooted and grounded in love, that you may have the power to comprehend what is the breadth and length and height and depth. It's like, how many prepositions can we get in there, right? It's big, is what he's trying to say. And know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, who is able to accomplish abundantly far more than we can ask or imagine. I think Paul knows that we need our roots well anchored so that we're free to imagine. If we are spending all of our time and our energy on maintenance, if we're spending all of our effort on just getting by, we're not free to look up, are we? We're not free to really understand how big this grace and love of God is, how big this potential is for what God has planned for us in our lives or in our community of faith, if we are sort of constantly just barely keeping up. And so Paul is praying for the people that he loves as we pray for one another, that our roots would go down deep, that we would be thirsty for that water that comes as this tremendous gift from God, so that as we are anchored, we're freed up to imagine. We're freed up to grow and to listen for the Holy Spirit. As we prepare to sing, the word root isn't in the hymn. It's hard to find hymns about roots. But the song is this picture of what it looks like when we are like this tree planted by water, rooted and anchored in the love of God.